can probably do the Q&A that way as well with so many people, but we could try the audio at the end as well. It gets a little messy. And as you can see from the lovely plants behind me and my map behind me, of course, I'm working from home. The Truman Library has been, the staff have not been in the building since approximately around St. Patrick's Day, middle of March. But the library and museum is actually closed anyway because we're in the middle of a museum renovation, which was supposed to reopen the end of October, maybe November of this year. We can talk a little bit about that later on. But I am ready to talk to you about Truman's presidency. I expect that will probably last about 40 minutes or so, 30 to 40 minutes, and then we can do questions at the end. Or as if you can't wait, type them in the box and we'll either catch them as we go or I will get them at the end. So I'll try and keep an eye on the questions. But if you want to wait till the end, that's fine. Go ahead.
Mark, they're pretty good at taking turns and asking questions.
So we can certainly, we can certainly do audio at the end as well. So that's fine. I'm going to share my PowerPoint and show you some of the images of Truman that help illustrate the story of his presidency. Of course, we can't cover everything, but we will. She'll give it a try. So let me see, and I get the slideshow running on this, and you should see that famous buck stops here sign on there. So, can you see that, Terry?
Yes, we're good.
All right. So I'm going to start here, probably with the thing that there's a few things that Truman's most well known for. We're probably going to cover quite a few of them here this afternoon. I know we're in different time zones all over the country. I happen to be in Central Time in Kansas City, where I live, about 20 minutes from the library in Independence, Missouri. And the book stops here sign is probably the one thing that people know, that Truman phrase, the buck stops here, and we have the original sign in our museum. And I think that's a good way to think about Truman's presidency, is that he had lots and lots of decisions to make. And over the years, most of them have been viewed fairly well, but we'll look at a lot of his different decisions as I focus on his presidency this afternoon. I'm going to primarily focus on some of the biggest decisions he made. And we'll talk a little bit about the years and the background of that as we go forward. So some of the decisions we're going to cover this afternoon, we can't cover everything, but we're covering a lot. I've got about 7 big decisions listed there: the atomic bomb, the Truman Doctrine, the Marshall Plan, the Berlin Blockade, recognition of Israel, the desegregation of the military, and the Korean War. We're going to mention all of those. In addition to those big decisions that he faced, we're also going to look at the 1948 election as well as we go by. So lots of different issues to cover, just to kind of give you a taster of the sorts of things that we're going to include in this afternoon's presentation. The first thing to mention, though, is before he's president, the fact that he's FDR's vice president in FDR's 4th term, but that is such a short vice presidency. He's only vice president for 82 days, because if you think back, we have the 1944 presidential election in November of 1944, where Truman becomes FDR's vice president. FDR successfully wins that 44 election and begins his 4th term in January. And the inauguration there in January, Truman becomes vice president January 20th at 1945. But by April 12th, 1945, just 82 days later, Truman becomes president. And you can see in this photo, and the reason I've chosen it is how ill FDR looks in that photo compared to Truman, who's smiling and vibrant and looking rather healthy. And FDR is not looking well. Somebody's saying they can't hear me very well. I'm moving a little closer to the microphone. So
it may be then, because I can hear you fine.
If you want to try the volume on your own computer,
right,
that might be the solution to that.
So if everybody else is okay, give us a thumbs down if it's not good. But I've been hearing you fine, Mark.
Sounds good. And we want to make sure everyone can hear. So maybe just check the volume on your own computer or on your speakers. So this photograph that I'm showing you now, and it looks rather grim, is the inauguration of Truman on April 12th, 1945. Truman was actually in the Senate building visiting some colleagues and got the call that he needed to come to the White House. They actually didn't tell him why he needed to come to the White House. But once they got there, Eleanor Roosevelt and others informed him that FDR had died. And FDR, of course, was in Georgia at Warm Springs, and he had died that afternoon. And at 7 o'clock in the evening, Truman takes the oath of office and becomes president. And in the middle of the photograph there is his wife, Bess Wallace Truman. He actually took his wife and his daughter, Margaret, who was in her 20s at the time. She was about 21. She was born in 1924. And so Margaret was actually getting ready to go out on a date. And Bess stops her and says, you need to change your clothes into something a little more formal and head over to the White House. And that's where they did the inauguration. So Truman becomes president in April, and very quickly he has to get to work. By July, he is in Germany meeting with Joseph Stalin and Winston Churchill. Cara says she's got his sound maxed, can barely hear him. You might want to look, there's a couple of different sound settings. So both on your speakers and on the computer itself. So there may be a couple of different options you can try on the sound.
So thank you.
He is in Germany for this conference, and of course, he becomes president in April. Germany surrenders in May, actually on his 61st birthday, on May the 8th, 1945, what we now think of as VE Day, Victory in Europe. And the consequences of that German surrender is that the big three, Britain, Soviet Union, and the United States, meet in Germany to decide what to do now that the war in Europe is over. Now, of course, the war in Asia, the war in Japan, is still going on. So they're also meeting to discuss that as well. So he actually goes by ship. He goes by the USS Augusta. Takes about 10 days to 2 weeks to sail across the Atlantic, to meet with Stalin for the very first time, and to meet with Winston Churchill for the very first time. And they're in the suburbs of Berlin for their Potsdam Conference, where they agree on some things, disagree on others as they get together. While they are there, while they're at the Potsdam Conference, Truman receives this report, which includes this sketch from Lieutenant Groves, who's in charge of the Manhattan Project. So it's while he's in Germany that the successful testing of the atomic bomb takes place in New Mexico. And they send him the report and tell him all about the atomic bomb. And so it's while he's there, he has to make that decision to drop the atomic bomb on Japan. This is from our archives, this is a diary entry from while he's in Germany on July 25th. And I know it's hard to read, but I'm going to read a couple of sentences there for you. He said, we met at 11 o'clock today. That is Stalin, Churchill, and the US president. He's the US president, so he's referring to himself in the third person, which I find intriguing. And he talks about some different things, and then later on in that first paragraph, he says, we have discovered the most terrible bomb in the history of the world. And he goes on to talk about how we might use it against Japan. Lower down, halfway down the page, the weapon is to be used against Japan between now and August 10th. I've told the Secretary of War, Mr. Stimson, to use it so that military objectives and soldiers and sailors are the target and not women and children. And he goes on. And of course, that ends up not actually being true. It does, in fact, affect women and children. But it's pretty fascinating that we have that diary entry in our archives. And there you see the photograph of the atomic bomb. And of course, it's been a very controversial decision, but it does lead immediately to the Japanese surrender, and then the ceremonies and surrender on the USS Missouri in Tokyo Bay. And then as we move on, because we've got lots of things to discuss, that's the biggest decision he probably makes. He doesn't say it's actually the most difficult decision he makes. We're going to come to that one a little bit later, that takes place in 1950. But as a result of the Potsdam Conference, divisions between the United States and the Soviet Union begin to grow, and we see the onset of what we call now the Cold War, and the division between the Soviets and the United States, who had been allies in World War II. Truman takes care of those with two major policies. One is the Truman Doctrine, and the second is the Marshall Plan, and they're intrinsically linked together. The Truman Doctrine was brought in to protect countries from communism. The initial aim was aimed at Greece and Turkey, and Truman goes to a joint session of Congress and manages to convince them to pass a $400 million aid package for Greece and Turkey to ward off a communist threat, and that succeeds. And the other you're probably more familiar with is the Marshall Plan, headed there in the photograph on the right is George Marshall, his Secretary of State. And George Marshall advocates economic aid to countries that have been destroyed by World War II, primarily Western European countries, France, the Netherlands, Belgium, Western Germany, and so on, and the UK. The money was actually offered to the Eastern Bloc, but the Soviets, who had at this point controlled that area, rejected that money and termed it as being kind of economic imperialism, is the criticism of that. But the Marshall Plan begins to help rebuild Europe and rebuild some of the countries that we'd been fighting against the United States, such as Germany and Italy during World War II. So it was a very innovative, different approach to rebuilding countries that you'd been previously fighting against. Truman was a soldier in World War I earlier in his life, and he saw the ruins of the Treaty of Versailles and how that did not work, and the German reparations after World War I, and learned from that lesson and advocated that through the Marshall Plan. And putting Marshall's name on it really made sure that it was going to pass through Congress, because Truman wasn't always that popular with the Republicans, particularly in the Senate and the House. The Truman Doctrine was 1947, and the Marshall Plan started in 1947 and was really enacted in 1948. 1948, though, becomes a huge year where Truman probably has to make the most significant decisions throughout his presidency, and it's also an election year. So we're going to talk about the election as well, but we're going to talk about three big decisions that he has to make, two of them in foreign policy and one of them in domestic issues, that all happen all kind of at the same time. And 1948 has been dubbed by historians as the year of decisions, because Truman faces these decisions one after the other. We'll take them in order that are on the slide. The first is the recognition of Israel. And just to back up a little bit, the British had held a mandate in Israel since the end of World War I, part of that Treaty of Versailles and Balfour Declaration. But by the spring of 1948, the British had warned that they were going to end the mandate and they were going to leave Palestine. And the Zionists and the Jews in that area claimed that they were going to form their own new nation of Israel. Truman comes into this because he is being pressured to recognize this new state of Israel, to give it legitimacy. And it's probably the one major decision that he has to make that is some of his own cabinet members actually disagree with him. That's pretty unusual. Throughout his 7.5 years as president, his cabinet is very much on his side and backs most of what he wants to do. But when it comes to the recognition of Israel, some of his own cabinet members are split and opposed to him. One of those is the gentleman I just mentioned, George Marshall. He is adamantly opposed to the recognition of Israel. And the reasons for that is that they thought it would immediately lead to war between Israel and the Arab nations. And they were proven correct. It did, in fact, lead to war immediately. And he thought that Israel could not stand up to the other Arab nations and the United States would be called in to defend them. But they also were worried about access to Arab oil, that if they favored the Israeli point of view, then the United States would be cut off from the Arab states and access to oil. So it became quite a complicated issue. There was a very famous meeting in the Oval Office where Marshall actually threatens Truman and says that he would actually split from him in an election year and vote against him. But Truman negotiated, and this is where he shows his man management and his leadership, and he talks Marshall around eventually over time and promises Marshall that they would have democratic elections in Israel and would hold off on full recognition of Israel until that happens. And that actually happens in January of 1948, January of 1949. In May of 1948, though, Truman does give temporary recognition to Israel, and that was applauded by those in Israel and by the Zionist community. The second one on list there, and these kind of happened at the same time, is the desegregation of the military and the Berlin blockade. Let me just put these in order for you. The Berlin blockade starts in June, and we're going to talk about that in a moment. The desegregation of the military actually takes place in July, but we're going to deal with that one first because Truman approaches this issue actually in February. He does a speech to a joint session of Congress where he advocates his civil rights program. So not just the integration of the military, but a number of other civil rights programs as well, which comes a bit of a surprise to some of his supporters. He's grown up as a Southerner. His grandparents on both sides of his family owned slaves in Missouri, and Missouri, of course, was a Southern state. And he had that very much in his upbringing. So some of his own personal friends and supporters were surprised about his move towards advocating civil rights. Many historians have looked at this. A lot of them put down his experience as a soldier in World War I and seeing troops on the ground. And there were African-American troops in World War I from the United States serving in segregated units. But when those African-American soldiers came back from World War II, 20 years later, a lot of those African-American soldiers were actually beaten, lynched, and not treated well. Some were even murdered. And there was a famous case where an African-American soldier was blinded by a sheriff in South Carolina. And Truman had had enough and didn't think that veterans should be treated this way and advocates to do something about it. He sets up a commission to look at civil rights in the United States and then does this speech in Congress in February. But all of the legislation that he puts forward is rejected by Congress. So he uses an executive order in July to integrate the military. As commander-in-chief, as the president, he can do that, and he orders integration of the military through Executive Order 9981. Now, this has political ramifications because during the political convention in July of that year, the Southern Democrats walk out of the party convention and form their own party. So it looks like Truman is going to lose that 1948 election because many of his party in the South have deserted him, and they literally physically stand up and walk out of the party convention in July. If that was to happen today in our current election year to either candidate, you would think that that candidate was certain to lose if you've got people on your own party walking out and forming a third party. Strom Thurmond leads the Southern Rights Party, known as the Dixiecrats, and all the pundits seem to think that Truman is going to lose the election in November. The other issue that takes hold in the summer of 1948 is that Stalin blocks Berlin, which had been divided at that Potsdam Conference that we mentioned earlier. Germany had been divided into 4 zones, the Soviet zone, the American zone, the British zone, and the French zone. And by the summer of 1948, the British, the French, and the United States had combined their 3 zones into one. Unfortunately, Berlin was far inside of the Soviet zone, and Berlin as a city was also divided in those 4 zones and those 4 countries. And Stalin blockaded the western part of Berlin from the Allies. Now, this was not the time of the Berlin Wall. This comes later in the 1960s. But in 1948, Stalin blockades the roads, the trains, the canals. So the only way to bring in supplies to West Berlin, which makes up about 2 million people at that time, the population of Western Berlin, was by plane. And you can see that photograph on the right. And Truman orders the beginnings of the Berlin airlift, which lasts for the next 15 months, where they supply the West Berlin population by plane. It's a mammoth effort, logistical nightmare. They even build a new airfield in the French sector. I see the question there, Donna. I'm going to take it a little bit later on if you don't mind. So those issues are all taking place in an election year. So the 1948 election, of course, takes place in November the 2nd, and you're probably very familiar with the Whistle Stop campaign and Truman traveling around on the train approximately 29,000 miles in kind of a innovative campaign that really builds momentum. When it starts out in the summer, it's rather labored, and Truman is reading from a script, and it doesn't go down very well. In September, when he does the second leg of the journey of the Whistle Stop campaign, his advisors recommend to him that he speaks off the cuff and he's a little less prepared, and he gets more fired up and more emotional, and that was more appealing. And I just love this photograph. We have more than 100,000 photographs at the Truman Library, and actually you can see about 60,000 of them online. We've digitized them, and you can go to trumanlibrary.gov and see these photos. But I just discovered this one in the last month. We do have color photos. Most of our photos are black and white, but I just love this photo. And the reason I like it so much is not just that it's color. I see the beaming. I'm assuming the father behind the little girl. I think he's got that father's vote just by shaking that girl's hand. But his goal of his campaign was to go and meet the people one-on-one. Even from the back of a train, he would talk individually to individual people, and even people who were witnesses to those speeches felt like he was addressing them personally. And so this photo sums that up to me. I'm assuming she's standing on a box or something, but that's how the photo came to us. And of course, it's very well known for this photograph because all the pundits thought that Truman would lose. But of course, he causes a great upset and wins the election. This photograph, if you didn't know, was actually taken in St. Louis. He wins the election. He stays in Independence in Kansas City for another day, and then the next day he takes the train to St. Louis on the way to Washington, D.C. And when he arrives in St. Louis, of course, he's Missouri's only president. So he's very well greeted in St. Louis coming over from Kansas City. And somebody hands in the Chicago newspaper. And those of you that know baseball and know your cities know there's a big rivalry between St. Louis and Chicago. So the St. Louis residents were only too happy to rub Chicago's noses in it because the Chicago Daily Tribune had printed the wrong headline. And they even ordered their newsboys to go out and destroy and get rid of those newspapers, but they couldn't get them all. And Truman was handed one and captured with this very famous photograph from the back of the train, looking pretty happy. So he goes into his second term, and his second term is pretty much dominated by the Korean War. He tries to enact some domestic legislation through his fair deal programs, and some of his reforms in education and civil rights and so on do quite well, and some of them the Congress doesn't like. But in the summer of 1950, he's actually in his home in Independence when he gets the call that North Korea has invaded South Korea. Ultimately, it leads into a stalemate around the 38th parallel and this is a United Nations effort. Truman calls on the United Nations to support him, and he does not go to Congress for a declaration of war. Instead, he goes to the newly formed United Nations that was formed in 1945 in San Francisco. And so it's a coalition force that's pushed all the way down to the southern tip of Korea, and then it pushes back. And then Truman has to make a fateful decision when the troops cross the 38th parallel, dividing the nation, whether to push forward and to push the North Korean forces all the way to the Chinese border and Manchurian border. He does make that decision, and as a result of pushing past the northern part of the 38th parallel, the Chinese join the war and push the United States back and the United Nations forces back to the 38th parallel. So it becomes a stalemate. And of course, his decisions during that Korean War, the one that most people tend to focus on, and you can see the photograph of the two of them together at Wake Island, is the firing of General Douglas MacArthur, who Truman feels has violated his powers, as Truman considered himself the commander-in-chief. And you can see some of the photographs and maps from the conflict here. And Truman ends up firing MacArthur and replacing him with Matthew Ridgway. And this is a document from our archives where he lets MacArthur know that he's been fired and that Matthew Ridgway is to take over. Most of the reasoning that Truman gives for this is that MacArthur is not following orders, and he's making public speeches and even has congressmen making speeches in the Senate against the president and for MacArthur. And it becomes really a constitutional question of who's in charge, the general on the ground or the commander-in-chief. Truman does actually discuss with his aides and with the Joint Chiefs of Staff before he makes this decision, but it's wildly unpopular. There's calls for Truman's impeachment over the issue. Over the years, that opinion has changed somewhat as people look at comments that MacArthur made that have been released since then, promising that China would not get involved in the conflict when he meets with Truman at Wake Island and so forth. So I just wanted to finish up, and then I will answer your questions, showing you some of the pictures from the museum. Now, I mentioned before The Truman Museum is currently under a $30 million renovation. We've been closed since last summer, actually, been closed just about a year. Our goal is to reopen in late October, early November of this year. I actually received some photographs earlier today. The museum renovation plans have gone ahead despite the current pandemic, but none of our staff is there. So all the contractors installing the exhibits and so forth have been working tirelessly throughout the shutdown. This is a photograph of an area of the museum that's not changing. We have a replica Oval Office at the Truman Library and Museum, and this is based on 1950 photographs taken by Abbey Rowe of the National Park Service. And it's a beautiful part of our exhibits. And that part of the gallery will not change. And you can see Truman's desk and the flags and family photographs behind him. And I want to point your attention to those that are sharp-eyed this afternoon. There's a television set over on the right side of that photograph. Truman was actually the first president to have a television in the Oval Office. So I think that's kind of fascinating. He bought that television in 1948 for $100, which seems kind of crazy. Now, of course, they don't even have a television in the Oval Office. They've got an office next door that has televisions tuned into stations all around the world. But of course, in 1948, there were very few channels that you needed. The next slide, we do a lot of education programs, and this is a group of third graders from Independent School District. And the reason I show you this is that President Truman was a graduate of Independent School District. So I think he'd be pretty proud that we have 1,200 students from Independent's third graders come into the museum about Truman's life and his presidency. The other thing you may not realize at the Truman Library, in our courtyard, in the center of the building, President Truman and First Lady Bess Wallace Truman are actually buried on the site in the courtyard. And this photograph shows the burial sites. Bess Wallace Truman is actually buried on the left side, and Harry Truman is buried on the right side. They actually died 10 years apart. So President Truman, born in 1884, another 10 years. Bess Wallace Truman died in 1982 and still holds the record as the longest living First Lady. You can't see it in this picture, but I'm sure you'll believe me. Also interned, they were cremated, as Margaret Truman, the one and only daughter, who was born in 1924. She died in 2008, and her husband, Clifton Daniel, their ashes are also buried, interned in the courtyard. Just to the right of this, you'll see a sidewalk right in front of that gravesite in the bottom right of the picture. Just to the right of that sidewalk, we have the ashes interned of Margaret Truman Daniel and her husband. And then in the back of the photo, you'll see a tree and then some glass windows. And that is actually Truman's office that he worked in the building. The Truman Library opened in 1957, and the photo on the top left corner shows the front entrance of that. And Truman worked in the building up until his death in 1972. He would walk from the Truman home to the library and work there every day. And so that building, that glass that you see in the background, is actually the entrance to his office that you can visit and see the inside of his office when you come and visit the museum when it's reopened. So with that, I love this photo of this third grader who's in awe of the library. And I'm going to stop my video, and we have one question so far, so I am going to take that. After leaving the presidency, regretted not acting on or wish that it would be stronger on. Now, this is just my opinion. I think there's two that come to mind. Although he did so much on civil rights, I think he even said himself he wished he'd been able to do some more, but Congress wouldn't let him. But he did what he could do through executive orders. But there are some other actions that he could have taken. So I think he could have done more on civil rights. The other issue, I think, is more to do with McCarthyism and the Red Scare and all of those hearings that McCarthy held, accusing people of being communists and so on. Truman, I think, regretted that he allowed McCarthy to do so much. And one of the factors there is Truman himself and his own cabinet were being accused of being soft on communism, despite his attempts to stop communism in Greece and Turkey, and stop communism in Berlin, and stop communism in Korea. He was still accused of that. And so, because of that, he kind of let McCarthy have more power than he wished. And I think in his retirement, I think he regret or comment, I guess. Was there a lot of opposition to the Truman Doctrine, the Marshall Plan? Not necessarily. I think there was a lot of bipartisan support. Truman had a really good relationship with Senator Vandenberg, who was one of the lead Republicans, so that helped. But Truman felt by putting Marshall's name on the Marshall Plan and calling it that rather than the Truman Plan, that it was going to be easier to get passed. And the amount of money for the was the amount of money for the Truman Doctrine. The Truman Doctrine, from memory, was about $400 million. The Marshall Plan ended up being close to $11 billion. So it really needed bipartisan support. And it continued for quite a while as different countries appealed for aid. A side comment, my daughter conducted research at the library for a PhD. I'm glad to learn from this well-done lecture. Thank you. And Cora, that's a great comment, and please let your daughter know that we always love having researchers at the library. Unfortunately, we can't right now, but we do have a lot of PhD students and even high school students come in and do research at the library, and they can also do a lot online on our website. We've digitized so much in the last 20 years. I will say that the research that those students do, both high school and university students, we learn so much from them as they uncover things all the time. It's kind of amazing. For those who don't realize, we have 16 million documents in our archives at the library. So you can never be done researching when you're looking at the Truman administration, even his early life, his letters from France when he's in World War I, writing to his then girlfriend Bess, later his wife. Just as an example, we have more than 1,300 letters that he writes to Bess from 1910 to 1957, and all of those are digitized. So you can read those if you're interested in reading letters from Harry Truman to his girlfriend and then wife, but they're really insightful. We have another question. Would you say that Harry Truman knew more about foreign relations than most of our other presidents? I can't really speak to other presidents, but I will tell you that Truman was an avid reader, and he was always a lover of history. Now, some historians put this down to the fact that at a very early age, he wore glasses. I've seen first grade or second grade class photo, where he's wearing glasses or he's holding glasses in his hand, which meant that he didn't play sports a lot, and he was far more encouraged by his mother, who really was the advocate of education in the house, to read. And one of the things that he read a lot of was histories of famous men, histories of famous women. And he was very much, read a lot of biographies. So when it came to the historical background of issues, he knew about them. I mentioned the fact that he went to Potsdam and he went by ship. It took almost 2 weeks to get to Europe. The reason he did that was so he could read up on the issues, because he'd only been president a few months. So he felt like he needed to do the research and read about the issues so that he was well prepared when he met Churchill and Stalin. Um, did Truman get involved in politics, presidential elections following his retirement from the presidency, or stay away from it? Thank you, Donna. Actually, he did campaign for Adlai Stevenson in the 52 and the 56 elections. He didn't necessarily see eye to eye initially with John F. Kennedy, but a neat story gives me an excuse to tell this anecdote. During the Eisenhower administration, who of course followed Truman into the White House, Eisenhower did not invite Truman to the White House once during those 8 years that Eisenhower is in office. But the day of Kennedy's inauguration, he invited Truman to the White House. And we've got wonderful photographs in January of 1961 in Kennedy's first week in office with Truman visiting. Truman had done the same thing for Herbert Hoover, even though Hoover was a Republican. During the three terms of FDR's presidency and those 82 days in his fourth term as office, he did not invite his predecessor, Herbert Hoover, to the White House. But when Truman became president, even though Hoover was a Republican, Truman invited Hoover to the White House after, 12, 13 years in exile. So two good stories there about Truman did get along well with most of the presidents. By the time it came to the LBJ election in 64, Truman was getting a little bit older and less able to campaign, I would say.
Mark, this is Crystal Webster. For some reason, I cannot do the chat. It doesn't work. But I have two questions. The first one is, do you consider this Potsdam Conference the start of the Cold War, or was it just a joyful reunion at the end of the war in Europe?
I'm gonna call Crystal out. She's one of our docents at the Truman Library. So, great question, Crystal. I think it started earlier. If not the Yalta Conference with FDR, maybe even the Cairo Conference prior to that. I think it started earlier. The information coming from the likes of George Kennan and other advisors to Truman and to FDR about the situation in the Soviet Union, I think it started sooner than that. Would be my initial answer. I'd have to think a little bit more carefully about that. I think I got all your question. Seems like there was a second part of your question, though.
Yes, I have a second one. On the map of the Koreas, you show a straight line, the 38th parallel.
Just artistic license.
Okay. When was the border finalized? Or do you have any idea?
Well, I mean, they based it on the 1953 armistice, and then it's been refined over the years.
Okay.
But of course, we know there's never been a peace treaty.
Right.
So technically, North and South Korea are still technically at war. It's an unusual situation that it's still an armistice. And of course, that whole area is a demilitarized zone. But it's shifted a little bit. But 1953 is probably the closest you would get with that armistice under the Eisenhower administration. And then it's kind of evolved a little bit from there. I hope that.
And
the graphic I showed was just a representation of that line because it isn't really a straight border.
Yeah. I have one comment, please, that I want to make, very short. Vienna was also divided by the Allies into 4 zones,
Correct.
Just like Berlin. And I remember being a very tiny little kid, and I remember my mother being ecstatic when we got the care packages. Whenever the Americans were in charge, because the 4 powers rotated in Vienna. So when the Americans were in charge, we always got the best rations. And I remember her being ecstatic getting the care packages. That's all.
Thank you, Crystal. I've got a couple of one question and one statement. One from Donna. What past presidents were significant to Truman to draw upon and learn from his own presidency? I'm going to answer that question. First, I'm going to do a plug for the Truman Library Facebook page because our social media person has been doing a series of Truman's comments on previous presidents. And they're choosing letters and different documents. And you can go back and look at what they've said. And I think today was about Harding or yesterday. But you can see his comments, positive and negative, about, they haven't done all of them, but lots of presidents so far. In my mind, he mentions positively a number of times Andrew Jackson because he sees him as the creator of the modern Democratic Party. And Truman actually dedicated a couple of Jackson statues in the Kansas City metropolitan area and Independence itself. When he's referring to the United Nations, he draws a lot on Woodrow Wilson and his support of the League of Nations and how he regrets that that wasn't backed up. Of course, he talks a lot about Lincoln and Washington. And of course, FDR, his predecessor. There's some great video footage from the 1944, getting my years right, the 44 party convention. And even though Roosevelt is not in the building, Truman kind of looks to the ceiling and raises his hand up like he's talking to a spirit or to a god. And that's how he kind of saw FDR. So those are off the top of my head. Carol mentioned that George Patton wanted to finish off Russia at the end of World War II. It would have been incredibly difficult. And let me tell you why. Most people think, using the atomic bomb. After the second bomb was dropped on Nagasaki, there was only one bomb left. They only had 3 made at that time. So that would have been pretty difficult. I'm sure that winning on the ground with troops would have been significantly difficult when you think about the Nazis in Stalingrad. And of course, they were still allies. So I'm not necessarily sure George Patton's advice was the best. They did claim they would have had 10 atomic bombs by November, however. So some comments about Facebook. Tells the story of his work in the soda shop. So his very first job was at Clinton's drugstore, which is still available. You can still visit that. It is a soda shop now, but it was a drugstore that he worked in. He was about 14 years of age, and he often commented about people coming in to get, how do we put this, under the table liquor from the drugstore. So he noticed right away there was some corrupt practices in the drugstore. If that's the story you were going for, I hope I told it. If not, if there's another story you're thinking about, let me know and I can tell that one too. But he was only about 14. It was seen as his first job. It's right in the middle of Independence Square. It's right on the corner. And today it sells ice cream and it's a soda fountain and neat little place that you can see where Truman had his first job. Crystal asked earlier, was the Potsdam Conference the start of the Cold War? I think we answered that question, Crystal. I think it just took a long time to come in. So that's how the chat works. Nancy says she has ice cream there in 2013. Very wise choice, Nancy. The ice cream there is delicious. We often take our interns there. When our interns graduate from the library, we go for pizza and ice cream at Clinton's drugstore and claim it's associated to work. So it's all totally legit. If you do get the chance to visit Independence, you certainly need to go to the Clinton drugstore, as it's called now, or the Clinton soda fountain, as it's called now, and get an ice cream. And the soda fountains too are pretty neat. All right. Any other comments, questions? He was always referred to as a hat salesman. Okay, I didn't really cover his early life, but one of his first job after World War I, when he came back from France, he opened a haberdashery or a clothes store, which sold hats, collars, ties. He went into business with Eddie Jacobson, who was his army buddy. They'd actually operated an army canteen together during World War I, and they decided to go in business together in 1919 when they returned to Kansas City. It was where they operated that. So that's why he was known as the hat salesman. It was his
Mark,
clothing store. Yep.
I think that those hats must have been wildly popular because that's how I think of my grandfather's in a hat just like that.
Right.
So they must have really taken on.
Well, you would think, but I'm going to disappoint you.
Oh, really?
Because of the depression in the 20s, the business went bust. But the good story that really tells about Truman's character is that over the next decade, he spent paying off his debts, and he paid off all his debtors. By the time he was a senator in 1934, I believe, he had paid off all the people that he owed money to. But a lot of his early customers actually, whether they were interested in hats or not, I don't know. But a lot of his early customers were his comrades in arms from World War I. All of his army buddies that came in. He was a captain, of course, of Battery D. A lot of those soldiers came in and were his main customers in downtown Kansas City were from his times in France and in Oklahoma in training. So that helped him. But unfortunately, the economic downturn really didn't help. And eventually, the store went out of business. And that's when he turned to politics. He became a county judge or county commissioner. It wasn't a legal position for Jackson County, where Independence is. And that eventually led him to being the U.S. Senator from Missouri in the 30s for 10 years before he became vice president. Any other questions?
Questions for Mark or comments? You can unmute your mic one at a time if you have anything before we
I have a question.
Go for it.
There's always been a rumor or politics saying that he was connected with the Thomas Pendergast.
I was waiting for this one.
You got to talk to a Kansas City born one.
Yeah, well, I'm originally from England, so I can't say much about Kansas City, but I can tell you about the Pendergast connection. Yeah, it actually goes back to World War I as well. And Boss Tom's nephew was an army buddy of Truman, and that's how Truman got introduced to Pendergast. And there's no denying that Truman would not have become the county commissioner. I'm going to use commissioner rather than judge, even though that's the title I used at the time, because judge gives the wrong connotation. It was an elected position, equivalent to a county commissioner today for Jackson County. And he ran as Pendergast's candidate. And then Pendergast also put him forward for the Senate. Without Pendergast's support, he would not have gotten the start that he did in politics. In fact, when he went to Washington, D.C. in 1934 or January of 1935 as the U.S. Senator, he was nicknamed the Senator from Pendergast. So that association was very strong, and they knew about it across the country. It wasn't just something they knew about in Kansas City. He eventually was able to shake that off. And in fact, in our archives, we have a lot of what we call longhand notes, which are written notes that he wrote himself but never mailed to anybody. But he kept them, and we found them later in desk drawers and so forth. And in a lot of those, it's kind of his personal writings and his own misgivings about Pendergast and others that he writes about, and you really get an insight into his own thoughts and his own trials and tribulations as he really worries about anything that he's doing. So certainly he wouldn't have got his start without Pendergast. But when he becomes president, it's pretty much all over. Pendergast dies when Truman's vice president. Actually, he's criticized because he flies home from Washington, D.C. in terrible weather at Christmas time to honor Tom Pendergast. And he's criticized for that. But by the time he's president, Pendergast is dead. There isn't much evidence of him influencing any decisions he made as a U.S. Senator, but there is some evidence that he hired people recommended to him by Pendergast, put them on the payroll, or as county commissioner, gave concrete contracts to Pendergast companies, things like that.
As in the paving of Brush Creek.
Right, and, you know, other things that you needed to fill holes for.
Interesting your comment about Truman and the drugstore. My father had a drugstore at Armour and Truce during the 30s, and he did the same thing for his doctors.
Right. Well, and that, and then his early part as a county commissioner, he saw a lot of the corruption in the Jackson County Commission, and what the other judges were doing, hiring people who shouldn't have been hired, or submitting contracts that shouldn't have been given out, things like that. He was exposed to that corruption pretty early on. But I mean, he'd been a captain in World War I in France. It wasn't like he had not seen the world at that point.
Right. Thank you.
Great question, and great to have a Kansas City in on. Any other comments, questions?
Thank you.
Thank you. That was a lot of fun. If you do have questions that you think about later, I'm going to type my email address and then you could always email them to me if you think.
And Nancy's asking for the website address too, and
I will put that in there also.
Right, and guys, if you go to I've tagged the Truman Library several times on our Facebook page because I've shared some of what Mark was talking about. So that's been really interesting what they've been posting, like on a regular basis.
Yeah, and the website I put in the chat, but it's pretty easy. It's trumanlibrary.gov, and then knock yourself out, search away. Look for the online documents and look for the photographs, and then you can search and find things. But if there's something in particular you're looking for and you can't find it, use my email address, send me an email, and I can help you find it. And just as a quick advertisement, Thursday night, I don't even know what day it is anymore, Thursday night this week, 6 o'clock Central, I'm doing a presentation for the Truman Library Institute about Truman and the atomic bomb. So 6 p.m. Central, and I'm actually focusing on 10 artifacts from our collection in the museum and in the archives that are about the atomic bomb. One of those is an artifact. I'll give you a sneak peek. It's the safety plug that was used on the bomb that was dropped on Nagasaki, that the gunners replaced the safety plug with the live plug, put the safety plug in his pocket, and it ended up at the Truman Library many, many years later. Wow. So you can learn about that and then 9 other artifacts that tell the story of the dropping of the atomic bomb. 6 o'clock Thursday night, Truman Library Institute program. And you'll probably find that on our social media, or you can email me and I can send you the link. I believe it's free.
I'll be sure and share that. Is it going to be over Facebook or Zoom?
I believe both.
Okay, good.
Yeah.
How about on YouTube?
I think it will be on YouTube afterwards, but not live. Doing live on YouTube is a bit of a technical challenge, but it's easier to capture and put it on there later.
Okay.
Truman Library does actually have a wonderful YouTube channel, and even has footage of the 1948 election and Truman's television series from the 1965, where he talks about many of his decisions. So I would encourage you to search that out on YouTube. Some wonderful videos. The very first video footage we have of Harry Truman in the 1920s, it's a silent video from, I think, 1927. I might have the exact year wrong. And he dedicates a marker to the DAR in Lexington, Missouri. And he's in this white suit. And it's a wonderful piece of black and white footage. And it's the first known video footage of Harry Truman. And we just found out in the last 12 months.
Wow.
And it's on YouTube.
That's
so there you go.
Fabulous.
Thank you, everybody.
Thank you. This was
Thank you, Mark.
Thank you,
very
Mark.
informative.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Thank you very
Thank
much.
you, Terry.
Bye, guys.
Bye-bye.
Thanks for coming. See you next
Thank
week.
you.
We're going out west.
Bye.
See you next Tuesday. Bye, Teresa.
Thank you
Bye-bye. Thank you for coming.
for the
Bye, Dawn.
presentation.
Bye, Donna. Y'all take care. Stay nice and cool and stay safe. Bye-bye.
Bye.
See you Tuesday. Oh, Dan and Sue.
do I take the virtual background away?
That's a good question. Probably just turn off your computer, I guess. I mean, go out of Zoom and you'll probably have to redo it, if you want to.
Ah,
Who is that? Carol?
yeah,
Yeah, there you go. You're off.
I
It's
think I
off.
got it.
You're on the regular screen now.
Okay, yeah, I figured it out. Thank you. Good program.
It was a pretty background.
Well, it was pixelating our faces.
It has to do with your computer, like how up to date your computer is. I've learned because I've had the same issue.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay.
Anyway, we're fine. Y'all take care.
Bye.
Bye bye.